So I wanted to talk a little bit about perception and extrasensory perception. But before we can get to extrasensory perception, we have to first understand perception. And there's a lot of misconceptions around perception. So to dig into perception, we'll use vision as an example because that's a big sense for a lot of people. That's a big perceptual sense for many people. The way the current explanation of vision works is that there's photons come in and hit your eyeballs, and then as the photons hit the eyeballs, there's receptors that are linked to nerves, and as the receptors are stimulated, it alters the frequency at which the nerves are sending action potentials to the brain. And action potentials are little electrical bursts, so the nerves are kind of sending off sort of a Morse code into the brain that's saying I'm being stimulated by a red photon at this frequency, and then if I'm not being stimulated by a red photon, then the frequency is slightly different. So as the red photon comes in, the frequency of the little electrical burst down the nerve changes, and there's millions of these cells, probably about 1 million, maybe thousands or something. I don't know what the exact numbers, but a lot. And they're all attached to the eye, and they go back to the brain. So this data in here causes a sort of a frequency that goes to the brain and then is quote unquote processed into vision. And we know that if you do this, vision stops. We know that if you remove the eyeball, vision stops, or if you cut the optic nerve, vision stops. So vision seems to be something that takes place within this optic thing. And then there's also a couple of visual processing centers in the brain that if they're damaged, you can't see things. But sometimes you can still sense things. So there's experiences like blind sight where people can't see objects, but they respond to objects, not consciously though. So that's fascinating. For this theory of perception and neurology to work, it requires processing, in that there's a signal that comes in, and then that signal goes through various brain channels, is modulated, whatever, and then out comes the other end, the actual vision data that is tied in, and you look at it, right? So it's the vision, according to this thing, is being processed from somewhere, because if you can cut the optic nerve, then sight isn't taking place up here, right? Because it's not gotten to the brain yet. And so this has to get somewhere to the brain for the current understanding of consciousness and perception for it to cause anything, which implies that there's a processing that takes place so that the action potential starts here and then it's modulated, and only once it gets there, it gets to the end. Processing implies that there needs to be some place for the processed information to end up. So this is where the data is unprocessed, and then if it gets processed, or like a computer processes data, then it needs an end result for the data, which is we've got sensory input, boom, 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 but there's really no end result for when an action potential or an impulse or a nervous system enters the body. It doesn't go anywhere necessarily. We do know that the data has to go to certain places to generate certain experiences. So for the body to have an experience of having an arm, it does need sensory data, and nerve impulses from the arm do need to seem to make it up to this part of the brain. And without that, then it's difficult for the body to experience, at least part of the body that is controlled with identifying as the mouth doesn't perceive itself as having an arm. It's very difficult to ask what an arm is experiencing without that connection that this body is sort of aware of. And so when you look at this and you realize that there's no really end place for the information to go, it's not being processed in a way. It's going in, and there's no observer. There's no observer anywhere. So what are we looking at? We do know that what we're looking at has something to do with the electrical activity. If the electrical activity of the body stops, like the resting membrane potentials that are around every single cell, if the nerve activity is interrupted, if the heart activity is interrupted, all of the electricity is interrupted, if the brain waves stop, we do know that all those activities are very much associated with consciousness. And so it would seems to make sense that the only way that what you're actually looking at is the electrical activity in your body, which electrical activity doesn't stop and start. Electrical activity is interconnected with all other electrical activity because it has fields. So it's generating fields that are interacting with all other electrical fields. Every single cell in your body is doing this. All the nerves in your body are doing this. And so, but Kurt, why does it look like there's processing going on? Well, for certain electrical fields to have a sense of continuity, they have to be heavily, heavily entangled. Heavily entangled for it to become physical. It has to be aspect from multiple different avenues for an object to become physical. It's a little bit like, you shoot a bunch of different lasers together, and it's all of a sudden you can actually create a little bit of matter type thing. So you're basically doing that with all of your perception. You reach out and you grab a pipe or something like that, and you're looking at it, you're feeling it, the sensory information is coming back. What happens in the brain is all of that information is entangled and related and correlated. It's not processed, it's just interwoven. So this signal meets my hand signal, all that is interwoven into a pattern as all these things crash into each other. These things are not being processed, they're just crashing into each other. You're looking at the sum total of that crashing at any point. And so some of that crashing together results in a story of time. As the sensory information comes back, there's not an end to its processing, so it keeps rebounding and resonating through the body as ripples through the normal tissue, as it goes in and slightly affects your heart rhythm, it goes in and changes your thinking. Like, all sensory information comes in and it's just constantly rebounding in a wave-like pattern. So as it crashes into each other, you can, it's reinforcing, it's a memory coming up out of somewhere. And all of this electrical activity is waving to and fro and frothy and wathy. And all this does up here is provide context. So if you're context focused, if you're logic focused, if you're thing focused, that's what a thing is. When you make a thing, you put something in context. That's Kurt Human inside in Seattle, 2014 March. You're putting everything in context, so you're interweaving it with all these other ideas and experiences and perceptions that are bouncing around and weaving through your body. But you're feeling the whole thing. All right, at no point do you suddenly start paying attention to the data from the optic nerve once it gets processed enough. At no point do you start suddenly paying attention to the data from your hand once it starts getting processed enough. There's not like a level of processing at which something can become part of your consciousness. If you're not very attentive as these things come in, you might not see them until they go in and they ricochet with a memory, right? So if you're not paying attention enough, you might not be able to see a tree right in front of your face because you've got so much stuff going on in front of you again that the perception of the tree has to come in, kind of snake its way into your mind, find resonance with the memory of your trees, and then it makes that thing pop into your perception again. And so if you're not living very much in the now, the only thing that you're capable of perceiving are things that resonate with the memories of what you've perceived. And if you're very much focused on the memories, of course you're only going to see what is sort of popping up more. That's what they mean when they say that you're in a dream state or not with the perception. So you've got, if you become memory focused, if you start focusing on the old patterns that are coming in and resonating with inside your system, which can get very loud because they start to reinforce from habitual lifestyles. The same day over and over and over again creates a very loud, like, self-reinforcing kind of electromagnetic noise in your body. So it makes it difficult to hear new things come in. As your consciousness and your attention gets focused on this one memory, this cave wall, Plato called it, of past sensations and everything coming around, you literally can't see the world around you as it comes in. Your sense of touch, your sense of sight, your sense of whatever, you're not paying attention to it. You're paying attention to something that's like, that used to be tied to it, this sort of internal story. As that data comes in, it comes in and resonates with whatever part of the internal story that you're saying. So then you start interacting with this. So the sensory data came in very subtly. It's subtle. It's subtle. You're so small, and you're taking in an entire universe of whatever. Every perception is so subtle. Your story is this self-reinforcing vortex. So these subtle ones come in, and they add a little bit of color and a little bit of light to the imagination that you are having, the hallucination. And they make it such that it at least mostly makes sense. The story that you're telling, it lets you actually interact with reality. It's close enough that you can even pick up and grab objects even though you're not seeing them. You're seeing the memory of the object, but the memory is being made very crisp by the new thing, so you can actually go out and see it. Extrasensory perception is simply looking at the data as it comes in raw and not tying it to your old story. That old story starts to die down, and so you get more and more subtle. You can feel things more and more. There's these particular waves and stuff that people emanate, that objects emanate, that locations emanate, that require a particular configuration of the nervous system to detect or modulate or hear. And so that if we get back to the sight extrasensory perception, you'll notice that like if you focus the sight, it's, you know, you look out and you see a kombucha bottle or something like that, and it's, you know, from a pattern or a memory that it's that this when the eyes are experiencing an object this far, you know that it's about that far, so you can reach out and grab it. So you know how much it weighs, you know what it feels like. These are all inducing vibrations into your nervous system that are very much entangled and correlated and tied to that kombucha bottle. And if you quiet down, you can let the whole body feel, you know, there's an electromagnetic resonance through all the cells with that resting membrane potential. You can start to let every single cell in your body be distorted by this kombucha bottle and feel how it is distorted. Like, what happened if I put this down and my hand's here? What is there any change that happens when I pick up this kombucha bottle? This hand is directly quantumly entangled with this kombucha bottle in a dynamic living structure. It's changing, the location of the kombucha bottle is changing properties of my hand over here because they're both in me. This hand, its properties are determined by myself. I'm letting myself be determined by the kombucha bottle. So when I'm quiet, I can actually tune into the kombucha bottle with both hands without having to have this hand touch it, because just by having it in contact with my sensory perception, I know that it's entangled and affecting all of my body. So I just get really quiet and I listen to it, and all of a sudden this hand is picking up information from the kombucha bottle which it's not touching, by listening to how the kombucha bottle is affecting the whole body. And this information is subtle, it's more nuanced than this, because this hand is almost overwhelmed by the texture, the firmness, the weight and everything of this bottle. It's getting a ton of information. This one can actually listen to even more subtle stuff about it. And so you can tune in more things than your hand to the kombucha bottle. You can tune in your whole body as, you know, as it's creating an optical pattern. You let that take over your whole body, and then you can see with your whole body, with every cell in your body, by letting your body be, by letting the sensory impressions truly come in to your body and resonate in real time, rather than reinforcing a memory or a dream state or a projection. And then that will allow your sensitivity to go up to a level to where people think it's sort of magical perception. But it's really not magical perception. It's just dropping the belief that there is processing that happens in the body. There's only intertangling and correlating. And the more that it intertangles and correlates, the louder it is, right? Because it gets in and it gets up into here, which is a closed resonating cacophony chamber. And the only thing that gets in here is what has been tied together at each ganglion spot in your spine. And all that data comes together as a big averaged loud, like, wow, this is what's going on. So if you put your mind up here, you get a fantastic story because everything's intercorrelated. You get lots of objects, you get lots of things, you get past, future, present, planning, strategy. But and you don't really, there's a lot more antenna space in the whole body. So you can put your mind down in these centers by the spine and start feeling the data before it gets processed. Unprocessed data is richer. It has less history associated with it. It has more nuance. It allows you to see new things, right? If you're up here, you literally can't see a new thing because you're in the dream state. You can only see what resonates certain things in the dream. So if the world starts changing drastically in your dream, whenever you started dreaming, your dream was 100% accurate, and then the world changed, and you decided to go with the dream instead of the world. So you got a 10% discontinuity because 10% of the world is something that's not in your dream, and so it doesn't resonate anything in your reality, and it doesn't light up those dream characters through resonance. As you stay in the dream, the world gets more and more and more divorced until you've only got like 10% of what's going on out in the world has anything to do with your dream state. So you only 10% of what's going on in the world resonates with anything within you whatsoever. This is why it starts to get very dull, is because you don't get stimulated by anything. Nothing out there resonates anything within your dream. Plato's cave. And if you get down to zero resonance, nothing stimulates you. If nothing stimulates you, you die. Your electrical activity ceases. Nothing comes in. But I mean, that's basically Plato's cave. It's just you can start to, as long as all of our science is based on believing the connections that this thing is doing, rather than studying the perceptions that is actually going on in the rest of the body that we can all feel. So you get into these different centers, and then the centers are taking in data from out there. So then you go in and you start feeling out there. And it's quieter, and out there has less context. It has less time. It has less, like, it's less habitual, less repeating. The cycles are larger. You look at the resonance oscillation going on inside the head, and it's like very time oriented and second, very high vibe, to where these natural oscillations are happening at a much slower rate. So you still get time, but not as much story, not as much sense of self and contextual stuff. And then also you get increased expansiveness, and you're feeling things, but it's not a logical thing. The logical thing is increasing sort of the fidelity and the cutting and the precision of everything that's bouncing around in here. It really has nothing to do with the pre-processed data, in a way. Neither one of them are necessarily. But this is a center. This is creating the universe. It is creating the context. It's creating the context. Without it, you don't really have anything. You need context. But it's also not the center of consciousness. It really has, the context has nothing to do with what's going on, and nothing to do with the perception or the the research. The context can't even once you're in the dream state, you can't even design a new instrument, because you wouldn't be able to recognize unusual results. It won't illuminate anything in the dream state. Science suffers from the same thing as racism. Once you get into the very racist thing, you could observe a black person behaving contradictory to everything that you've ever believed about black people, and you will still go to the grave thinking what you thought about black people. That's exactly what's happening right now with scientific materialism, is that it is basically racist as to the nature of how the universe works, and it can do experiment after experiment after experiment and see contradiction after contradiction after contradiction, and it will not be able to accept, state, or imply that the universe truly works in that way. And it's no different than a racist not being able to, that's, once you get to a certain age, your cognitive flexibility becomes atrophied if you haven't been training it. So you get to a certain age, and that's kind of why I'm starting my own school and doing my own thing, because those institutions, they, in my opinion, physically lack the ability to change and adapt to deal with, meet, or perceive the way that the world is currently happening.